The chandeliers of Merrill Auditorium glittered above us, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors. It was supposed to be Delaney's night, a celebration that she had planned with the precision of a stage director string quartet, towers of roses, a guest list swollen to 300. I kept to the edges of the room, comfortable in the quiet of observation, when her voice cut through the music. "Corinne," she called from the stage, a champagne glass raised in one hand, the microphone in the other. "Why don't you make this night complete? Why don't you hand over the keys to your cottage so we can all enjoy it as a family retreat?" At first, I thought it was a joke, a poorly timed attempt at humor. The crowd chuckled uncertainly, but Delaney's eyes, glittering with something sharper than champagne, told me she meant every word. I rose slowly, smoothing the skirt of my dress, and felt 300 pairs of eyes settle on me. I spoke evenly, keeping my voice calm. That cottage isn't a gift to be passed around. It was entrusted to me. The answer is no. The air thickened. Delaney's smile faltered, her new husband Brant shifting uneasily at her side. Then, before I could brace myself, she stepped down from the stage, heels clicking against marble, and struck me hard across the face. The sound cracked through the hall like a whip. My body reeled, balance slipping, and the copper taste of blood filled my mouth where my teeth caught my lip. A hush fell over the room. Someone gasped. Even the quartet faltered, bows trembling in midair. I straightened, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me fall. My cheek burned, but I would not raise my hand in return. I simply turned, walked through the parting crowd, and pushed open the heavy auditorium doors. The night air off Casco Bay was cold against my skin. I pressed a trembling hand to my lip, smearing blood, and pulled my phone from my clutch. For months, I had kept a number saved under a single letter. Tonight, I finally pressed it. The line rang once, then again. I held the phone tight, my breath steadying, as the voice answered. The phone still warm in my hand. I leaned against the stone wall outside the auditorium and let memory rise unbidden. The cottage had always been more than wood and shingles. It was the thread that tied me to those who came before. Built in 1898 on a bluff above Casco Bay, its cedar shingles had weathered salt winds and winter gales. Its small windows once glowing for shipbuilders and lighthouse keepers who sought refuge along the coast. Aunt Miriam, my father's sister, was the last guardian before me. She never had children of her own, and I was the one who spent summers helping her paint trim, prune roses, and patch the roof when storms tore shingles loose. She would pat my arm and say, "You understand what it means to keep something alive." When she died, the will left the cottage solely in my name. No one was surprised except Delaney. My sister's envy was subtle at first, wrapped in jokes about how unfair it was that the younger bride had no place to host holiday barbecues or summer gatherings. She would say it with a laugh, but her eyes stayed sharp, measuring what I had. The year after Miriam's death, Delaney began asking for the emergency key. She claimed it was practical in case I ever locked myself out, though the truth was clear when I arrived one July weekend to find her friends splashing in the cove and her husband grilling on my deck as though it belonged to them. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was family, that it wasn't worth a fight. I replaced the locks, but I did it quietly, never calling her out. Peace seemed easier than confrontation, and for a time, I convinced myself the small incursions weren't dangerous. But they piled up. Proposals that I turned the cottage into an investment property, that we rented out for weddings or retreats, that I share the burden of taxes by signing part of it over. Each suggestion pressed heavier against me, like the tide pushing at the seawall. I should have spoken firmly then, but I told myself that silence preserved harmony. What I did not see was how silence also fed her conviction that my ownership was negotiable. The slap in front of 300 guests was not sudden. It was the breaking point of years of envy chiseling away at something sacred. As I wiped the blood from my lip, I knew peace had never been what she wanted. She wanted possession, And that was why I had taken precautions long before tonight, months before Delaney's wedding. I sat across a wide oak desk from Janet McKinnon, the steady tick of her office clock filling the silence between us. Her office overlooked Monument Square in downtown Portland, where students from the University of Southern Maine hurried past with backpacks and coffee cups. Janet leaned back in her chair, her glasses sliding down her nose as she studied the draft papers she had prepared for me. "You understand," she said carefully. "Once this trust is in place, the cottage is no longer just your personal asset. It's the property of the Halstead Trust, managed through the LLC. Utilities, insurance, taxes all will be paid through the entity. If you ever want to sell, it has to pass through the structure." I nodded. That's exactly the point. Keys don't matter if the paperwork is clear. Her eyes softened with concern. They'll feel betrayed when they find out. I folded my hands in my lap, thinking of Miriam's voice, the way she used to say I understood the weight of preservation. Better betrayed than dispossessed. Janet tapped her pen against the contract, then slid it across to me. I signed, the scratch of ink steady despite the knot in my stomach. When I set the pen down, I felt a shift like closing a door that had been left ajar too long. It wasn't only the trust that gave me comfort. I had begun to pay closer attention to Brant, my future brother-in-law, at family dinners. He spoke with a salesman's ease, slipping in remarks about land values and development potential as if he were making idle conversation. But I noticed how he always steered talk toward real estate, how he pressed Delaney about leveraging assets. Once, while clearing dishes, I overheard him on the phone whispering about coastal properties and collateral. His tone clipped, his eyes darting when he realized I was nearby. I started keeping a notebook in my bag. Dates, snippets of conversations, names I didn't recognize. It felt paranoid at first, but the more I wrote, the more a pattern emerged. Brant wasn't just curious, he was circling, calculating. By the time the wedding invitations were mailed, the trust was already filed with the county registry. The cottage no longer stood in my name alone, and the notebook in my drawer was filling with evidence that the man Delaney married saw my inheritance not as history, but as opportunity. The night air off Casco Bay was raw, carrying the tang of salt and the muffled sound of gulls. I pressed my handkerchief to my lip, steadied my breath, and scrolled to the name I had saved months ago. Janet answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, measured, the way it always was when I felt the ground shifting beneath me. "It's happened," I told her, at the reception. She demanded the keys, in front of everyone. There was a pause, the scratch of her pen audible even through the line. "And you said no." I said no. I confirmed. She struck me. Janet exhaled slowly. "Stay where you are. I'll be there in 30 minutes. When I ended the call, my hand hovered before dialing again. This number carried more weight. Detective Raphael Montrose was not family, not friend. He was obligation, consequence. We had spoken twice before, once in his office at the Cumberland County Courthouse, and once over coffee near the ferry terminal. He had asked about Brant's sudden interest in deeds and valuations. I had told him what I overheard. Tonight, the final thread had snapped. "Halstead," he said, his voice low and direct. "Do you need me?" "Yes. At Merrill Auditorium. Tonight." "I'll come," he replied, and the line went dead. I stood alone under the stone archway, the music inside the hall sputtering back to life, though it carried a strained note. Through the glass doors, I saw guests whispering, shoulders bent together, eyes flicking toward where I had stood moments earlier. Delaney's voice rose above them all, shrill and insistent. "I'll get the deed tonight. She can't keep it from me." Humiliation still burned in my cheek, but beneath it was something steadier. For years, I had chosen silence, hoping to preserve peace. Tonight, silence was over. The first to arrive was Janet, coat draped over her arm, briefcase in hand. She took one look at my swollen lip, then at the restless crowd behind the doors. "It's time," she said simply. Moments later, Detective Montrose pulled up in an unmarked sedan. He stepped out, tall and deliberate, his presence drawing curious stares from guests spilling onto the steps. His nod to me carried no ceremony, only certainty. I drew myself upright, wiped the last trace of blood from my mouth, and pushed open the door. Humiliation had walked me out of that hall, but something stronger was walking me back in. The ballroom lights felt harsher when we stepped back inside. Conversations broke mid-sentence. The string quartet's music faltered, and 300 eyes turned to watch us cross the polished floor. Janet walked with purpose at my side, her briefcase locked against her hip, while Detective Montrose's presence carried the weight of authority no one dared ignore. The murmur of guests swelled into uneasy silence. Delaney was still near the stage, veil slightly askew, champagne glass trembling in her hand. Her smile froze when she saw who followed me. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to echo. "Why are you back?" Janet set her case on the nearest table, snapped it open, and drew out a sheaf of documents. Her voice cut cleanly through the silence. "Delaney Coleridge, you are hereby served with a cease and desist order for harassment and attempted coercion regarding the property known as the Halstead Cottage." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Delaney's glass slipped, shattering at her feet. Montrose stepped forward, holding a second notice. His tone carried the finality of a gavel strike. "Brant Coleridge, you are served with inquiry papers tied to fraudulent loan applications. Records show you used the Halstead Cottage as collateral without authorization." The blood drained from Brant's face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, eyes darting to the exits. His business associates, clustered at the bar, began to edge away, whispers cutting through the still air. One of them muttered something about contracts and exposure. Janet lifted another document, her voice unwavering. "This is a notice affirming that the Halstead Cottage is held in trust under the Halstead LLC. Any attempt to claim ownership, transfer, or collateralize the property is legally void." Delaney's hysteria broke loose. "Lies," she screamed, clutching at Brant's arm. "All lies. She's making this up because she can't stand to share." Her voice cracked, wild, and she shook her head so hard her earrings flew. "It's our cottage now. It's family." Brant tried to hush her, but the effort only made him look more cornered. His jaw clenched, his charm evaporated, and sweat glistened under the lights. I could almost see the calculations crumbling in his mind, the deals, the projections, the easy money. The officiant, who had lingered awkwardly near the stage, raised his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, some order." But the words had no power. The spectacle had already shifted. Around us, guests whispered furiously. Old friends of the family exchanged looks of pity. Vendors glanced at each other, uneasy about unpaid balances. Brant's business partners slipped toward the doors, leaving him stranded. I stood rooted, my cheek still sore, my lip still swollen, but steadier than I had felt in years. The hall that had witnessed my humiliation was now watching something else entirely, the unraveling of a lie exposed under its own weight. Delaney's cries rose higher, Brant's face grew paler, and the crowd leaned closer. Hungry for the truth they had not expected to see unveiled on a wedding night, the ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. It had turned into a tribunal. Guests who only minutes earlier had been laughing over champagne now formed tight knots, whispering and pointing. The clatter of plates from the catering staff sounded louder than it should have, punctuating the air like verdicts being delivered. Vendors were the first to act. The florist, a woman with green-stained fingers, approached Brant at the edge of the dance floor, her voice sharp but controlled. "Your balance isn't settled. I'll need payment tonight." "Behind her," the band leader added. "Same for us." No check, no music. It was as if the carefully spun fabric of the evening had unraveled at every seam, and Brant stood helpless as threads pulled loose. He tried to muster that practiced grin, the one that had charmed investors and smoothed over doubts. But now it flickered like a dying bulb. "There must be a mistake," he insisted, his tone strained. "Everything's covered. We'll sort it out." His words fell flat. No one believed him anymore. Montrose spoke quietly with a cluster of witnesses' family friends. Even members of the bridal party who had seen Delaney's slap and heard her demands. Pens scratched across notepads. Statements were taken. What had started as gossip hardened into record. I stood off to the side, watching the collapse unfold. For years, Brant had played the role of visionary, promising Delaney that her life with him would be grander, brighter, more secure. He had pointed to my cottage as if it were a stepping stone, a resource waiting to be harnessed. And Delaney, resentful that Aunt Miriam had chosen me, had listened. I remembered her voice at a family dinner, sly with persuasion. Why not make it a wedding venue? Imagine the money, the prestige. Corinne can't just keep it locked away. At the time, I'd stayed quiet, thinking silence was safer than confrontation. Now, the silence ended. Delaney turned to me, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her dress wrinkled where she had clutched it too tightly. "You've ruined everything," she sobbed. "It was supposed to be ours. Brant said it was right, that you'd never really use it the way we could. You don't even have a family." Her words cut, but not as deeply as she hoped. I touched the bruise swelling on my cheek and met her eyes. "You wanted my silence," I said, my voice carrying in the hushed hall. "You got my answer." The crowd shifted, a murmur running through the room like a tide pulling back from shore. Delaney's shoulders sagged and Brant's jaw tightened, but neither had anything left to say. Their masks had slipped, and everyone present could see what lay beneath. The officiant cleared his throat and gestured weakly toward the exit. But the night was already broken. What had been a wedding was now something else entirely. And I knew the reckoning wasn't finished yet. The days that followed moved with the weight of wet wool. Newspapers didn't cover the spectacle at Merrill Auditorium, but Portland society thrived on gossip, and word traveled faster than print. At the museum where I worked, colleagues avoided the subject, though I caught them whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. I kept my head down, cataloging maritime maps, but the bruise on my cheek told its own story. Janet called within the week. "We need to settle this before it festers. Mediation is the cleanest way." So I found myself seated in her downtown office, the tall windows framing a gray sky over Monument Square. The conference table between us was polished to a shine, papers neatly stacked at Janet's elbow. Delaney sat across from me, shoulders hunched, hair pulled into a loose knot that looked nothing like the careful arrangement she'd worn at her wedding. Brant was not present. Montrose had made sure his obligations kept him elsewhere, answering questions about the loans. Delaney's eyes darted to mine, then away. "I never meant for it to go that far," she said, her voice small. "I thought it would bring us closer." I folded my hands, steadying myself before speaking. "Closer isn't what you wanted. You wanted control." Janet intervened with practiced neutrality. "Here are the conditions. 1 repayment of the sums borrowed from Corinne over the years, on a fixed schedule, with interest waived. 2, no entry to the cottage, no spare keys, no family use unless written consent is granted. 3, a formal letter of apology, acknowledging the assault and the coercion." Delaney's face reddened. "A letter. You want me to humiliate myself." "You humiliated yourself," I answered quietly. "This is acknowledgement." For a long moment she stared at the tabletop, then snatched the pen Janet slid toward her. Her hand shook as she signed each page, initials scrawled in the margins. When she dropped the pen, it clattered loud enough to echo. "I hope you're satisfied," she muttered. Satisfaction wasn't the word. Relief, maybe. Not triumph, just a weary kind of peace. I gathered the copies Janet handed me, tucking them into my bag as though they were ballast keeping me steady. When Delaney left, the door closing behind her with a hollow click, Janet exhaled. "It won't heal everything, but it draws a line." I nodded, the knot in my chest loosening just a fraction. Outside, The clouds had broken, sunlight spilling briefly across the square. For the first time in weeks, I felt the possibility of air unthickened by anger. The cottage waited for me in Cape Elizabeth, and I knew the final step would be taken there. By the time I drove back to Cape Elizabeth, the season had shifted. The trees along Shore Road were bare, their branches etched against a sky the color of slate. The wind coming off Casco Bay rattled the shingles of the cottage as I pulled into the gravel drive, the sound both familiar and oddly comforting. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and salt. I set my bag down and opened the small box I had carried from Janet's office. The documents inside were crisp, stamped with seals, proof that the cottage's protections were no longer just in my head, but fixed in law. I placed them in the safe, turned the key, and exhaled. The next task was simple but symbolic. I had hired a locksmith to install smart locks on every door, codes known only to me. Watching the old brass tumblers come off, I felt a pang of nostalgia, but when the keypad lit up blue under my hand, I knew I had chosen right. Keys had always been vulnerable to duplication. Paper and codes were harder to steal. Still, I kept one key. Its edges were worn from decades of turning in familiar locks. I placed it inside a shadow box, mounted above the fireplace, and wrote a single word on the plaque beneath Boundaries. It was not a warning to others as much as a reminder to myself. In the following weeks, I met Janet at a cafe near the harbor. Over steaming mugs, we sketched plans for a small community fund, one designed to help caregivers, mostly women who found themselves pressured into surrendering property or assets. It was a modest start, but I knew Aunt Miriam would have approved. She had always said preservation wasn't only about buildings, it was about people. That evening, I lit the lantern in the front window, the same one my aunt had tended every night she stayed here. Its glow spread across the yard and into the dark beyond, a steady signal against the winter wind. For the first time in months, I felt no weight pressing down, only the quiet assurance that the cottage was mine to protect, mine to live in, mine to pass on when I chose. The house stood solid against the cold, and I knew the doors that would stay locked and the ones I was ready to open.